It was a night I'll never forget. The kind of night that sticks to your bones, the kind that haunts you. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was June 1973. I was in St. Louis, Missouri, and I had just arrived at the hotel. My bags were still unpacked when my receptionist burst into my room, breathless and panicked. "Dr. Nick, there's a call from Vernon. He says it's extremely important." I picked up the phone, my heart already pounding. Vernon's voice was shaky, almost broken. "Could you come out and see if you can do something for Elvis?" My mind raced. It had been 6 months since I last saw Elvis, and he was in perfect shape then, looking fantastic during his satellite special in Hawaii. But something was off. There was a deep, unspoken worry in Vernon's voice that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my black bag and headed out, knowing that whatever was happening, it was bad. When I arrived at the hotel, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The rest of Elvis's entourage was downstairs, ready to leave for the show, but Elvis was nowhere to be seen. Joe, his trusted friend, was already upstairs, pounding on Elvis's door. When there was no answer, he used his extra key to get in. The sight that greeted us was horrifying. Elvis was still in bed, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. He had lost control of his bowels and kidneys, and the sheets were soiled. It was a scene of sheer helplessness, a far cry from the vibrant, magnetic performer I knew. My hands trembled as I pulled out a syringe and prepared a stimulant to help regulate his breathing. I touched his cold, damp skin, and it only made my resolve stronger. We needed to act fast. Joe and I managed to get Elvis undressed and into a cold bath, hoping it would shock his system back to life. Slowly, he began to respond. His vital signs improved, but he was still far from the Elvis everyone knew. By the time call, Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, burst into the room. Elvis was just starting to regain some consciousness. Parker was furious, waving his cane and shouting about getting Elvis on stage no matter what. I stayed by Elvis's side, speaking softly to him, trying to calm him down. "You're going to be okay, Elvis. The worst part is over." I kept repeating. It was a mantra, as much for me as for him. Within an hour, he was on stage, but it was clear he was struggling. He seemed half asleep, his performance lackluster. The audience was bewildered, but no one knew the full extent of what had just happened. As the night dragged on, I couldn't help but think about the last time I saw Elvis. He was in perfect health, a megastar at the top of his game. What had changed in just 6 months? His bloated appearance, his swollen hands and face, all pointed to something seriously wrong. When he finally agreed to let me try to figure out what was going on, he had to rush back to Los Angeles. There was a deep hurt in him, something he wouldn't talk about, and it only added to my concern. A few weeks later, I got another urgent call from Graceland. Elvis was back from California, and he needed medical attention. His breathing was labored, and his condition was alarming. I rushed to Graceland, and what I saw almost made me turn back. Elvis was unrecognizable. His face and hands were puffy, his lips and eyes swollen. His breathing was labored, and his stomach was distended. I knew we had to get him to the hospital. At Baptist Memorial Hospital, we ran a series of tests. The results were shocking. Elvis had hepatitis, a fatty liver, and Cushing syndrome. His body was swollen from excess corticosteroids, and his stomach was full of air and feces. The black and blue marks on his body were a mystery at first, but Elvis eventually admitted they were from syringes used by an acupuncturist. The situation was dire, and we needed to act fast. Dr. Leon Cole, a Beverly Hills physician, had been giving Elvis Demerol and cortisone shots to ease his chronic back and neck pain. The combination of drugs had led to severe addiction. We had to start Elvis on a methadone regimen to wean him off the Demerol. It was a tough conversation, but Elvis needed to understand the gravity of the situation. As I stood there watching Elvis struggle, I felt a mix of sadness and determination. I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was determined to help him. There was no time for despair. We had to focus on getting Elvis back to health, one step at a time. Elvis came back to Graceland on November 1st, 1973, free from the medications that had landed him in the hospital. I was relieved, but knew I had a lot of work ahead. I wanted to help him with his insomnia first, thinking it was the root of his other problems. I suggested he go to a sleep clinic, but he wasn't ready for that, so we tried an experiment. I told him to stay awake as long as he could until he fell asleep naturally, without any sleeping pills. I even got Sam Phillips, who owned a recording studio, to make a sleep tape for Elvis. I told Elvis, for the first time in a long time, you have nothing to do and nowhere to go. You can read, watch TV, or do whatever you want. But the experiment didn't work. Elvis stayed awake for 3 days and nights. His cooks, who loved him, started making all his favorite dishes to keep him busy. He ate a lot, which only made things worse. I realized I needed a new plan, so I focused on his diet. I tried to get his cooks to make healthier meals, but they just stared at me like I was crazy. They were loyal to Elvis and would cook whatever he wanted. I figured it would be easier to control his diet on the road than at home. I had another serious talk with Elvis about his medications. I told him I couldn't trust him to handle his own medicines anymore. I wasn't saying he was doing it on purpose, but sometimes he took something when he was half asleep, thinking it would help him go back to sleep. I explained that this could be why he had problems before. I told him, let me handle your medications. You call me if you need me. It worked for a while, but then he started to resist. He said, I'm an adult. Why can't I handle my own medicines? Why do you have to babysit me? I reminded him what had happened before and told him, this is the only way I can be responsible for your medications. After resting for 10 days, Elvis went to Palm Springs and then to Los Angeles to visit his daughter, Lisa Marie. When he came back, he was very tired and had trouble getting the band he wanted for his recording sessions. The whole thing was a big disappointment, and he was really down. I thought Lisa Marie's visit might cheer him up, but he seemed more depressed. I suggested he see Dr. Knott or Dr. Fink for a follow-up, but he said he could handle it on his own. I was worried because his depression was causing physical symptoms, and I knew his body needed more time to heal. Elvis's adrenal glands weren't working right after his hospital stay. They were okay under normal circumstances, but not when he was stressed. By the end of the year, it was clear that his depression was getting worse. I thought he finally understood that actions have consequences, even if you're Elvis. In January 1974, we convinced Tom Parker to cut Elvis's Las Vegas engagements from a month to 2 weeks. This was a big win. Elvis's first show back was amazing, and he got great reviews. After the Vegas trip, my son Dean and I went to check on Elvis. Dean was good at racquetball and offered to teach Elvis. Elvis loved the idea because it was a fun way to stay active and get exercise. We planned to start after his next tour. Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, didn't like me being on tour at first. He thought a doctor wasn't necessary. But when Parker hurt his hip, I gave him a cortisone shot, and he realized a doctor could be helpful. By then, Elvis and Parker were having a lot of arguments about their business. They tried to avoid each other, but it was causing problems. Elvis played Memphis for the first time since 1961. The shows were a huge success, and Elvis was nervous but amazing on stage. He could feel the crowd and knew what they wanted. The fifth show was so good that RCA recorded it and released it as Elvis, as recorded live on stage in Memphis. When Elvis went to Tahoe for his next engagement, I felt confident enough to just go for the opening and then return to Memphis. I had a nurse, Tish Henley, stay with him. I couldn't trust Elvis with his own medications anymore, so Tish was there to make sure he got what he needed. In Tahoe, there was a problem with a drunk fan who caused trouble. Elvis's bodyguards had a hard time getting the fan off his floor. The tabloids made a big deal out of it, but Elvis wasn't even there when it happened. This made Elvis even more anxious, and his weight kept changing. He was frustrated and would make jokes about it. Some people thought his drug use increased with his weight, but I don't agree. His stress from performing so many shows with little rest was the real issue. Elvis's Vegas opening in August 1974 was disappointing. He tried new songs, but the audience didn't react well. The next night, he went back to his old songs and added more karate moves. The fans loved it, and critics said he looked trim and was having a great time. I was relieved that the shorter 2-week schedule was working well. During this time, Elvis met Sheila Ryan, a sweet actress. They stayed in Vegas after the shows and relaxed. I thought it was a good sign that he was doing well. Before going back to Memphis, Elvis bought a Stutz Blackhawk car, his favorite. He also gave cars to his friends and family, like a double-wide trailer for his cousin Billy and a boat for Charlie Hodge. One night, he bought 11 Lincoln Mark Roman 4s and 5 Cadillacs for his friends. Elvis always gave gifts when he felt good about a tour or guilty about something. On his 4th tour of 1974, Elvis got sick and had to leave the stage early. A few days later, he was back and gave a great show at Notre Dame. But 2 nights after that, he performed terribly. Entertainment reporters were confused about what was wrong with Elvis. I was in Memphis, but Vernon called me, worried about how Elvis looked. He asked me to meet the tour in State Line, Nevada, where Elvis would be performing for the next 10 days. When I arrived, Elvis was a mess. One of his doctors had joined him on tour and prescribed a medication that made his blood pressure go up and down. Elvis had trouble keeping his balance and controlling his muscles. To make things worse, on the first day of his show in Tahoe, he was hit with a $6,300,000 lawsuit because his bodyguards were accused of beating up a fan. Elvis was really upset and spent days in his room with Sheila. After his show at the Sahara Hotel, Elvis told me he was going to Los Angeles to look at a house he wanted to sell. But Sheila later told me they went straight to Las Vegas because Elvis wanted to see Dr. Gainham about a new sleep diet. Dr. Gainham had made a special liquid nutrient mix that was supposed to reset Elvis's metabolism and help him lose weight while he slept. Elvis loved the idea and decided to try it. He and Sheila stayed in a special suite Dr. Gainham had built for his celebrity clients. Elvis slept for what I heard was 3 weeks. When I found out about the sleep diet, I wasn't surprised. Elvis always looked for shortcuts. I talked to him many times about trying to have a more normal life, instead of relying on quick fixes. He would follow a routine for a while, but once the newness wore off, he would go back to his old habits. After he closed at the Sahara, Elvis spent Thanksgiving with Linda Thompson in Santa Monica, California. Later, he went back to Dr. Gainham's house for another round of the sleep diet. The mix was based on papaya juice, which was high in sugar and given to him through enrollment 4. Elvis was already on the brink of type 2 diabetes, and the diet was hard on his colon. Without physical activity, his colon stopped working properly, and he gained 10 pounds. He was really angry about it. When Elvis got back to Memphis, he didn't tell me about the papaya juice diet, but he looked much heavier. I tried to convince him to come to my office for tests, but he just blew it off. I learned from his aides that he was getting suspicious packages in the mail, and that one of his guys was secretly picking up parcels from the airport. Elvis had also become really interested in the physician's desk reference, thinking he could learn everything about drugs from it. He sometimes got into trouble by thinking he knew as much as a doctor. By the end of 1974, Elvis showed all the signs of severe depression, but he wouldn't agree to go back to therapy. We talked a lot about his insomnia, which I thought was a big part of his depression. When the body can't sleep, it can't heal. Elvis could only sleep for 3 to 4 hours at a time, and would sometimes sleepwalk. He wouldn't consider getting help, and I was getting frustrated. On January 29, 1975, Linda Thompson called me from Graceland, saying Elvis was having trouble breathing. Without checking on him, I called an ambulance to take him to the hospital. This was my chance to get some answers. After he was stabilized, we started a bunch of tests to figure out why his stomach was distended and pushing against his lungs. The tests showed high levels of barbiturates and the narcotic Demerol in his bloodstream. I was heartbroken. We worked for 2 weeks to find out what was causing his edema, and if his colon and liver were damaged. I didn't know when he had started taking Demerol again or where he got it, so I ordered a detox. Some people later used this to say Elvis was a drug addict, but that wasn't true. During his hospital stay, Elvis's room was made to feel like home. His guys covered the windows with aluminum foil and installed a direct phone line. One of his guys told me a doctor had sent Elvis some unlabeled drugs. I knew Elvis didn't always ask for the drugs he received. I asked Vernon if we could have the pills analyzed, but he didn't want to pay for it. A local doctor visited Elvis and gave him some medications without telling me. When I found out, I called the doctor and he said the pills were placebos, but I knew they were real. I was disappointed in Elvis for not telling me about the other doctors, and I was angry with the doctors for being unprofessional. I was also upset with myself for trying to reform Elvis. Vernon had a heart attack and was in intensive care. This made Elvis even more nervous. He asked the young nurses for extra sedatives. I knew he was worried about Vernon, but I also knew he was playing a game. When Vernon got out of ICU, he had a room next to Elvis's suite. The Graceland cooks brought them smuggled food, and the hospital started feeling more like home. After 10 days, Elvis was ready to leave the hospital. He wasn't a drug addict, but he was psychologically dependent on the drugs. I had been giving him more medication at night if he needed it, but I realized I needed to change how I handled his medications. Nurse Tish Henley, who lived in a trailer behind Graceland, would keep the medications and give them to Elvis at the right times. The medications were put in small, brown envelopes to keep them private and protected. I never included injectables in the envelopes, and only Tish and I were allowed to give Elvis shots. After he was discharged, Elvis was in good health. With his Vegas show coming up in a month, we all worked to keep him active. Dean had set up racquetball lessons, and we started playing at night when the courts were less busy. Elvis loved to win, so he wanted me to be his partner. If I couldn't play, he would choose Dean. By picking one of us, he eliminated his toughest competitors. Despite his health issues, Elvis went back to Las Vegas in March 1975 and did 29 shows. In April, he toured the South and Northeast, doing almost 60 more concerts. Sometimes Linda Thompson was with him, sometimes Sheila Ryan, and sometimes he added other models and starlets. I never knew who would be with him. He had some kind of code to keep track of who was with him, but he never shared it with me. Elvis loved performing, but the long tours were killing him. I tried to convince Parker to break up the tours into smaller segments, but he wouldn't listen. I knew how exhausting the tours were, and it was even worse for Elvis because of his sleep problems. In 1975, he became overwhelmed. His third tour of the year started badly. Sheila wasn't available to go with him because she was involved with James Caan. To spare Elvis's feelings, they told him Sheila had an ear infection. Elvis got a low-flying plane to bring her on the tour. As Sheila started to pull away, Elvis became more determined to keep her. He bought her a horse and invited her to move in with him. It must have been hard for both of them to say goodbye. Elvis was devastated when Sheila left. No matter what Joe or I did, it wasn't enough to cheer him up. The trouble started during a show in Cleveland, Ohio, and continued the next night in Nassau, New York. Finally, in Norfolk, Virginia, the backup singer Kathy Westmoreland told Elvis to stop making personal remarks about her. He did, but then he started making inappropriate comments about the Sweet Inspirations. Two of them walked offstage and Kathy followed. After the show, Elvis got on the plane and we headed to Greensboro, North Carolina, where another strange incident happened. After we got to Greensboro around midnight, Elvis said he needed to see a dentist. We found one, and he took care of whatever was wrong. After that, Elvis grabbed a box of over-the-counter medicine, even though he didn't need it, and put it in a brown paper sack. He carried it like it was the most important thing in the world, but I made a big mistake. I took the bag from him in front of everyone. Elvis was really embarrassed, and so was I. I knew I shouldn't have done it. Back at the motel, Elvis was so mad, he was stomping around like a soldier. He slammed doors so hard the windows rattled. Then he went into his room and disappeared. Later, at his concert, he apologized to the Sweets for something that happened in Norfolk, but the audience had no idea what he was talking about. After the show, Elvis went back to the dentist alone, determined to do things his way without me interfering. The next day, we had another fight. Elvis always had a bus for us to ride together from the hotel to the airport. Someone suggested we stop for food before we left, thinking Elvis would be late anyway. We all agreed and stopped at a Dairy Queen. We were eating and chatting when suddenly, a motorcycle cop and Elvis's limo zoomed by. We all freaked out and ran to the bus, following Elvis to the airport. When we got there, Elvis was furious that our bags weren't loaded. He was ready to go, but we weren't, so he took off without us. We were left standing on the runway with our luggage. Elvis left us there for a few hours, just to teach us a lesson. Finally, his plane came back to pick us up. Everyone was relieved, but I was really mad. I thought his act was childish, and was planning to buy my own ticket back to Memphis. I realized Elvis was showing everyone who was in charge. If he wasn't on time, it wasn't our fault, and we had to be ready when he was. After we landed in Asheville, the band was so upset that they threatened to quit. Elvis found out and knew he was in trouble. He quickly sent someone to get his jeweler, Lowell Hayes, and started buying jewelry to say sorry. He bought so much that Lowell had to call his brother to bring more. Elvis bought gifts for everyone he had upset, and it was a huge, expensive gesture. Elvis's dad, Vernon, who was recovering from a heart attack, joined us at the motel. I was talking to Vernon when Elvis came out of his room with a hidden pistol. He put his arm around his dad, and the gun accidentally fired. The bullet hit the wall and ricocheted, grazing my chest. Everyone was scared, especially with Vernon's heart condition. Elvis tried to make a joke of it, but I knew he was shaken too. Later, I went to his room, and we talked about what had happened. Backstage in Asheville, Elvis wanted me to give him a shot to calm down. He was still upset and wanted a narcotic, but I gave him a placebo instead. I didn't think he was in pain. He just wanted to feel better. When Elvis was stressed, he often turned to things that made him feel good, like giving gifts or playing jokes. After the tour, Elvis asked me to visit Graceland more often. I used to stop by after work to chat and see what he was up to, but once I got there, I was stuck for hours. I tried to explain to my wife, Edna, how important it was to keep Elvis busy, but she said our family needed me too. So I started building a team to help keep Elvis occupied in healthy ways. I was excited when he got into racquetball. It was a great way for him to stay active, even though he wasn't very good at it. He would call time in the middle of a game and laugh, and we all had fun. Elvis loved watching football, especially at Liberty Bowl Memorial Stadium. If people knew he was there, more would come to the game, and they spent more time looking at him than the game. One night, Elvis noticed a pretty hostess named Jo Kathy Brownlee. He asked me to help him call her for a date. He gave her a car and a diamond ring, and invited her to Las Vegas. She couldn't go with him because she was going with her mom, so Elvis asked Linda to meet him in Vegas instead. We flew to Vegas on a smaller plane than usual. There was some turbulence, and the plane dropped suddenly. Elvis panicked and couldn't breathe. He made the pilot land, and I gave him a shot to calm him down. After we got to Vegas, Elvis was really tired. He had been playing racquetball and lost weight, but he wasn't as fit as I hoped. During his opening show, he had to sit down, which was unusual. He wanted to impress Jo Kathy and her mom, but he was struggling. After the first show, I tried to convince Elvis's manager, Parker, that Elvis was too sick to continue. Parker didn't believe me, but after 3 bad shows, it was clear Elvis needed to go to the hospital. His colon problems were getting worse, and he was bloated and having trouble breathing. His singing was suffering, and it was embarrassing for everyone. We left Vegas early, and Elvis went to the hospital in Memphis. His health was getting worse, and I was worried about what was causing his problems. I needed to figure out how to help him. In the mid-1970s, being a doctor was a lot harder because the equipment we had wasn't as advanced as it is today. We could tell that Elvis had a big liver and that it had a lot of fat in it. We wondered if the Tylenol he took for his arthritis might have caused it, but we weren't sure. We suggested he go to Johns Hopkins Hospital to get a better look at what was going on, but he didn't want to go. I called my pastor, Father Nicholas Viron, to ask if he could visit Elvis. I had been going to his church since 1955, and Father Viron had visited Elvis before. They talked about faith and religion, and Elvis was really interested in learning more. He even wanted to read some old church books, like one about exorcism. Father Viron made an English translation for him, because Elvis felt he needed protection from evil spirits. Elvis was very respectful to my pastor and my dad, Gus. My dad was a Shriner, and Elvis knew a lot about their beliefs. He wanted to read a very rare and expensive book about different philosophies and beliefs. It was out of print, so Elvis decided to have it reprinted. He got 2 copies and had them signed by the author. Elvis would read parts of the book. underline passages, and write notes to my dad. He was searching for a religion that fit his beliefs. After Elvis left the hospital, his condition was serious, so we needed to take extra steps to help him. Tish, one of his nurses, was already giving him his medications. We added 2 more nurses to his team, and they stayed in Lisa Marie's room close to his. My goal was to create a hospital-like environment at Graceland, so Elvis would follow the instructions for his recovery. Elvis enjoyed his time alone at home. He loved to read, meditate, and watch TV. He had a lot of books, and one of his favorites was The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. We talked about it a lot, and he would read aloud from it for hours. He made notes and highlighted phrases that he liked. Reading helped me understand who Elvis really was and what he wanted from life. As Elvis got stronger, we played more racquetball. But it was hard to find courts because the sport was getting popular. Elvis decided to build his own court behind Graceland. He included a weight room and a music room, so he could relax in his own backyard. Elvis's motorcycle group, L's Angels, started visiting our house. One day, they showed up while we were having dinner. Edna, my wife, was shocked because she thought the noise was just from a helicopter. When she saw Elvis at the door, she was even more surprised. Our house was a mess because the dryer had broken, and Edna had hung clothes everywhere. Elvis was a gentleman and tried to ignore the underwear swinging in his face. We had a short, awkward visit, and Elvis ended up offering to help us find a new house. Elvis was really excited about the idea of building a house. He wanted to design it himself, and even suggested adding a racquetball court in the basement. He said it would be a place to go when the dryer broke again. We eventually built a new house, and Elvis even wanted a bedroom there so he could have a Graceland getaway. Elvis got excited about simple things like hamburgers. One night I brought him some Greek burgers from home and he loved them. He asked for more and it became a regular thing. Our daughter Kissy would bring the neighborhood kids to deliver burgers to Graceland. Sometimes the cooks at Graceland tried to make them, but they never tasted the same. Elvis would call Edna and ask for the recipe over and over. He thought it was a mystery that no one could make them as good as she did. One night, after we had burgers at Graceland, we went to a movie. Elvis was in a good mood and gave Edna a small box. Inside was a beautiful ring with multicolored diamonds, representing the ingredients in her Greek burgers. It was a special gift, and only Elvis could think of something like that. One time, Dean called from Vegas to tell me a story. He and Elvis were in Elvis's suite, and they were talking about food. Dean mentioned a little Italian restaurant nearby, and Elvis got excited. He put on his sweatsuit and dark glasses, and decided to go with them. That's just the kind of guy Elvis was always ready for an adventure, even if it was just for a good meal. We started walking down the hall toward the elevator. Elvis kept turning to look over his shoulder every few feet. He got in and we rode down. He hung back for a minute until Dick got completely out of the elevator, and motioned that it was okay for him to walk across the lobby to the exit. Elvis looked from one side to another and whispered, "Think anybody will recognize me?" "Nah, Elvis," I told him. "You got your DA jumpsuit and sunglasses on, walking out of the Hilton at night. No one would ever guess who you are." I walked faster in front of Elvis to prepare our getaway. "I need a Hilton car," I told the valet, thinking it would be no problem. "We don't have one," the valet said nonchalantly. I was not prepared for that. "Man, I got Elvis coming out. Right now, I need a little help here." The valet got all flustered. He looked around and then said, "See the guy over there in the cowboy hat, old Tex? When he gets his date out of the car, you grab that one." I couldn't believe it. Old Tex's car was this huge Lincoln top of the line, and this valet was telling me to grab his car. He doesn't even know who I am. I just said, "Elvis," and he's gonna hand me a Lincoln. "Look, you gotta have it back in 2 hours," the valet whispered real fast. "He's going to the show. You gotta have the car back when he gets out." I looked up, and here came Dick and Elvis, hiding in his disguise, walking right toward me. I motioned for Dick to get behind the wheel. Naturally, he was the one to drive the hot car with Elvis inside. Dick's a former Palm Springs police officer, you know. I slid into the back seat real fast. like I didn't know those guys up front. We got to the little restaurant, and Elvis loved it. We ordered 8, and were out of there in 90 minutes flat. Dick wheeled the Lincoln back up to the Hilton entrance, and I dropped the keys into the valet's hand. He was kind of nervous by that time. "Thanks, man," I told him. I thought I was showing my gratitude by getting the car back on time. Right. Dick and I kind of shielded Elvis, walking back into the Hilton, unrecognized. We made a sneaky trip back up to the suite, so Elvis wouldn't be disappointed that there was no mob scene. We settled in, and I waited till Elvis got over the excitement of his night on the town. Then I told Dick and him about the hot car that carried us to the neat little hole-in-the-wall restaurant. Elvis just stared at me like he's not believing it. I thought, oh no, I'm dead. He said, "What, you mean that valet did that for us, gave us a car to use?" Whoa. I was thinking that valet impressed Elvis a lot more than the meal had. Yep, I told him. He sure did. I was proud. "Well, I think we need to show him we appreciate it," Elvis said and walked out of the room. Next thing I knew, I was handing over the keys of a brand new Trans Am to the valet. He's shocked like, is this a joke? Guess he'd never gotten a tip even close to that. Made me feel real good. As far as his daily life was concerned, Elvis was a creature of habit. He felt comfortable doing things in a certain order. That was about the only stability he had in his life. Elvis's work schedule varied, as did his medical needs, so I decided to develop a plan to ease the complexity of his having to take various medications at different times of the day and night, whether at home or on the road. We developed one protocol for life at Graceland, and another to prepare him for his shows. These protocols would vary slightly depending on where he was performing, and what was going on with him health-wise. On show day, someone would wake him up around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and he would start with black coffee. Then he would take some sort of appetite suppressant, sometimes innocent stuff, or sometimes amphetamine substitutes. After that, he'd take a decongestant and his blood pressure medicine. Then he would eat and relax for a few hours before getting ready for the show. I thought if I could get Elvis's medications on some sort of routine, we would have better control of any possible side effects from the medications interfering with his performances. His nights and days were twisted around, but he still needed to take meds and vitamins, regularly spaced between whatever else he needed to do to prepare for a performance. That ran a gamut from antacids to eye drops. I had a certain philosophy regarding administering medication. I'd prescribe the lowest dose possible so I could more easily adjust the doses and push the drug as far as it needed to go without pushing it to toxicity, the point at which a person could become sick from the medication. It made sense to me to use 2 or 3 drugs of a weaker value so they would not reach toxicity. Later, drug companies started doing that, putting 2 or 3 drugs in small doses in one capsule. They were not doing it much in Elvis's day. I also felt the medications could have a better effect when prescribed in increments from the time he awoke until he went on stage some 5 or 6 hours later. After he suited up on tour, I would give him a vitamin B12 shot. Elvis thought B12 helped him. That was a popular therapy in the 70s, so he had read a lot about the benefits of these shots. They supply an energy boost but also increase the appetite, so he had to be reminded of that. If he had some congestion, depending on its location and how problematic it was, I would decide whether to give him an antihistamine or a placebo. I would have to give him something for congestion because he was afraid he would clog up without it. That was one of his phobias. There were a lot of things going on with Elvis's eyes. He kept getting conjunctivitis from the dye used in coloring his hair. Elvis had always loved black hair, and because he was prematurely gray, he had it dyed regularly. He also had his eyebrows and eyelashes dyed black, and the dye would irritate his eyes when he sweated. In fact, originally the purpose for Elvis wearing the scarves around his neck was to be able to wipe his forehead to keep perspiration from falling into his eyes. After the ladies saw a scarf touch his face, they just had to have one, and his tradition of tossing scarves to the fans began. In the latter years, he developed photophobia from the bright lights. I often put a local anesthesia in his eyes. Since the anesthesia didn't last long, I thought it was just some psychological thing, but I did it. It did prevent Elvis from having to rub his eyes during a performance when excessive sweating would get into his eyes and cause them to become irritated. I was willing to accommodate him with whatever would not hurt him. I had learned the hard way that I had to choose my battles. He had developed the routine of taking a voice shot while he was in Las Vegas, where it is so dry. Dr. Sidney Boyers, a throat specialist, developed the secret concoction, a combination of 3 or 4 different herbs. Some say it was snake oil, a steroid, and a secret ingredient rumored to be liquid cocaine. There was no medical justification for it that I could find, but Elvis swore it'd help. There were times when his throat felt exceptionally dry, and he wanted us to take the liquid mixture in the vials we use for the shots and apply it in drops directly onto his vocal cords. It did not matter how his throat felt before he went on stage. He thought a treatment would prevent something bad from happening. Of all his phobias, his main fear was having his voice crack, or not being able to project as well as he should. Decongestants and B12 given as shots were routine for him as well. Elvis felt in order for something to be more effective, it had to be given in a shot. So we had a difficult time getting away from giving Elvis his medications in shots, particularly on the road, where his medications needed to be fast-acting. From what I have heard, every time Elvis took a shot, people around us thought it was some type of upper, an amphetamine, downer, a sedative, or painkiller, a narcotic. That simply was not true. After we got backstage, about 4 or 5 minutes before he would go on, I administered eye drop. After the show, assessment of Elvis's condition was more difficult. For that reason, throughout the show, I would watch his movements closely from the audience to determine whether his actions could cause a neck or back injury, since pulled muscles rarely got the rest time they needed to heal. There were a few songs like Poke Salad Annie that I could tell by the way he moved when he sang them whether he had sustained an injury. I did not want Elvis coming off stage and tricking me into thinking he needed something for pain when he really didn't. When I evaluated his pain to be moderate to high, I would use a diluted shot of Dilaudid. I needed a medication that was quick-acting for the pain, because many times he would have to return to the stage in a few hours. I coated 2 different strengths of Dilaudid that I had mixed with B12 or saline, so I could give him the smallest dose possible. A high level of pain can cause a rise in blood pressure, which could be especially dangerous the way Elvis exerted himself. I had to judge from situation to situation what was best. No sooner had we put the protocol in place than I was told by some of his aides that Elvis was going to other physicians to get medications that I would not give him. If I was going to be his primary physician, and he was my responsibility, then I needed to be the doctor to take care of him. It is professional courtesy when one doctor treats another doctor's patients for that doctor to call the primary physician and tell him or her what he is doing. When I learned who the doctors were and called them, they were embarrassed about what they had done. Elvis was entitled to choose whatever physicians he wanted, but if I was going to treat him, I needed to know what, if anything, other physicians were administering. I needed to have the information available to determine if something I had given him was causing a reaction or a particular side effect, or if it was from some other substance he was taking. Often people do not realize how dangerous some vitamins and nutrients can be when combined with certain medications. I tried to solicit full cooperation from those who were closest to Elvis on a daily basis to identify what drugs or supplements he might be getting from other doctors. The episodes people described during which he was obviously most adversely affected by drugs always seemed to happen in Palm Springs, Las Vegas, or LA. If I had seen Elvis during those reported situations, I could have better assessed what was going on at the time. I had to form an opinion based on what was described by only a couple of people who brought me into the loop with information about what they had seen. Those who had expressed their concern for him were already on board with the program devised for the control of medications I had not prescribed. A few of Elvis's guys were harder to convince. I tried to explain in detail, as logically as I could, to everyone involved that if we did not control the situation, it would affect not only Elvis but also their jobs. If Elvis didn't work, they didn't work. They finally got that. I had to use a stronger approach with the few people working for Elvis who abused alcohol, marijuana, and street drugs on their own time. Elvis would have fired them on the spot if he had seen evidence of their using drugs while they worked. They thought they were using on the sly. Users always think no one else knows. It was a tightrope. I wanted to get my point across in a way that would prevent these people from running to Elvis and ratting me out. There were a couple of guys who were continually tattling. They wanted Elvis to think they were looking out for him, that he could trust them more than anyone else, but it had the opposite effect. Elvis did not like dissension, and people who caused it did not last long in his employment. There was somewhat of a turnaround about that time. If the pilots flew out of town, they would call me. If someone had to go to the airport for Elvis, he would call me. Sometimes someone would pick up a package and bring it to my office. Elvis's use of recreational drugs was always a sporadic thing, as far as I could tell, a diversion when he was under extreme stress. Some stories have surfaced about Elvis experimenting with street drugs, but I never saw any evidence of that. Elvis and his guys viewed me as the run-to doctor for when they got really sick. In some ways, I was like a parent, who often is the last to know what is really happening with his kids when they are out of sight. Instead of his annual New Year's Eve party, Elvis closed the year performing in concert in Pontiac, Michigan, setting a world's record for a single show. An audience of 62,500 people attended, and Elvis made a reported record gross of $800,000 for a single performance by a solo artist. That night, Elvis had a right to be more nervous than ever. He had brought along a plane full of hometown folks for the event, including his longtime friend Bill Browder, who had worked as his RCA Records promotion man. Now a popular country music recording artist known as T.G. Shepherd, Browder had two #1 hits of his own that Elvis really liked, Devil in the Bottle and Tryin' to Beat the Morning Home. Elvis had talked T.G. into canceling a lucrative New Year's Eve gig and going with him for support. Nothing he said, however, could calm Elvis as showtime neared. Elvis kept imagining all kinds of terrible things that could happen on stage. He finally fixated on losing his voice. He began insisting that I fly in a throat specialist to treat his vocal cords. "Wait, Elvis," I said, desperately seeking a solution. "I know one of the nation's top throat specialists, and he lives right here in Pontiac. I'll get on the phone and track him down. Hurry," Elvis said, continuing to pace. I located the number and hoped it would connect me to my friend. "Dr. Fred, this is George Nichopoulos. How would you like to see Elvis's sold-out concert in a couple of hours?" His affirmative answer set the plan in motion. I told Elvis I was leaving for the lobby to meet the doctor. "Here's the deal," I told my friend after he arrived, and I could fill him in on Elvis's phobia of the hour. "You're the only one who can ensure that the show goes on tonight. You've got to be good at what you are about to do." Dr. Fred borrowed my laryngoscope and a few other instruments and placed them in his own black bag. Then we were off to see the king of rock and roll. Elvis was polite as usual and attentive to the specialist I had solicited to care for his delicate and priceless vocal cords. Elvis and I had been friends for years. He was like a big brother to me, always looking out for me and my family. One time, he even hypnotized me, or so it seemed. It was just before a big concert. Dr. Fred, Elvis's doctor, was getting him ready. He told Elvis to relax, take deep breaths, and stay still. After a few minutes, Dr. Fred said, "You are now relaxed and ready to go woo the crowd." I thought it was hypnosis, but it was probably just his way of calming Elvis down before the show. Elvis put on an amazing performance that night, but the press focused on a small mishap. They reported that Elvis split his pants during the show. It wasn't a big deal, but the media loved to talk about it, especially because it fit their fat and 40 narrative. They'd been using that angle since Elvis's 40th birthday in January. One of the best vacations I ever had was with Elvis in Vail, Colorado, in 1976. Elvis rented a huge house with big fireplaces and lots of windows that looked out over the slopes. He also rented 4 condos for his friends and family. Linda Thompson was there, and she became really close with my daughters, Kissy and Elaine. Linda taught them how to make snow cream and played Monopoly with them for hours. She was so kind and generous. Elvis gave what we called Elvis's life lectures. He would sit with us and talk about the importance of staying away from drugs and how they could ruin a person's life. He was so sincere and caring. He even bought snowsuits, ski boots, and gloves for everyone, and paid for us all to take skiing lessons. We were all having a great time. One day, the sun was so bright on the snow that Edna, my wife, got a severe migraine. She wanted to be left alone, but Elvis insisted on helping. He took her into his bedroom and started massaging her forehead, neck, and back while reciting Bible verses. It was a bit weird, but he was so earnest that it was hard not to laugh. Edna didn't want to hurt his feelings, so she told him she felt better, even though she still had a headache. Elvis was so proud, telling everyone he had healed Edna's migraine. Elvis loved speed and adventure. He would ride his snowmobile up the ski slopes at all hours of the night, even though the ski resort didn't like it. One morning, the police caught him and his friends, including my kids, riding beyond the red line. They thought they were in trouble, but Elvis flashed his badge and the police let them go. Another time, Elvis came up with a new game using Saucer's big, flat discs that you could sit on and slide down the slopes. It was dangerous, but we all went for it. Dean, my son, hit a fence post and hurt his knee. Elvis called an ambulance and went with him to the hospital, still wearing his ski mask. When they got there, the receptionist asked, "Where's Elvis?" And Elvis, still in his mask, said, "He's here, somewhere." It was classic Elvis. After Dean's knee was checked and he was given pain pills, Elvis offered to keep the medication for him. Dean, knowing Elvis's history with drugs, said no. Elvis laughed and let it go. Later, Dean and the rest of us went to Los Angeles with Elvis and Linda for a few days. Dean had to walk his St. Bernard Missy on a leash down Santa Monica Boulevard, which was pretty embarrassing, but Elvis thought it was hilarious. When Elvis's tour started in March, he asked me to bring Kissy and Elaine to Graceland so we could ride to the airport together. He gave each of my daughters a special necklace with a TLC Tender Loving Care logo, just like the TCB Taking Care of Business necklaces his friends wore. He told them, "Now you're members of my group." The girls were thrilled and wore their necklaces all the time, even to bed. Elvis's tours were grueling. He would get nervous before each show, and sometimes Joe Esposito, his friend and bodyguard, had to push him onto the stage. After the show, they would pack up and head to the next city. It was nonstop, but Elvis always gave his all. Later that year, Elvis had a problem with some of his bodyguards. They were fired without warning, and it caused a lot of tension. Elvis didn't like confrontation, so he didn't talk to them about it. Some of the bodyguards said they were fired because they confronted Elvis about his drug use, but I never heard anything about that at the time. It was a tough time for everyone, but we all stuck together. Elvis and I had a tough time after the racquetball court's mess. I remember when he called me to his house one night, asking for medications I didn't think he needed. I told him maybe it would be better if someone else went on the tour. We talked about it, but I still felt uneasy. I told Tish she might need to go in my place. The day before the tour, Elvis said he found another doctor to go. Tish went anyway. I sat out that tour and planned to do the same for the next one. But Tish called after the first show, worried about how Elvis was reacting to his medications. He bombed at the Hofheinz Pavilion in Houston. People were walking out. I was in a meeting with Mike McMahon when Barbara Klein buzzed me to take a call. It was Parker. He said they needed me back on tour. They wanted me to meet them in Mobile, Alabama, to take control of things. I told Parker I wouldn't come back unless Elvis apologized for the racquetball situation. It was hard for him to say sorry, but eventually he did. I talked to my partners at the medical group, and we agreed on a fee to cover my absence. I had never charged Elvis before, but my partners said they lost money when I was away. On tour, Elvis was struggling. I noticed the side effects of his medications, especially Sperine, which made him lethargic and affected his balance and speech. It was a tough balancing act to manage his medications without causing embarrassing side effects during performances. We made it through the next week, but it was really hard, especially after the grueling shows in Lakeland, Florida, and Huntsville, Alabama. I told Parker in front of Elvis that I couldn't be a part of seeing what this kind of schedule was doing to him. After Huntsville, Elvis never performed 2 shows in one night on the road again. In October, we started the 7th tour in Chicago Stadium. The next night in Minneapolis, Elvis was really into his performance, and the crowd went wild. It felt like old times, but after the tour, things got complicated. Felton Jarvis had everything set up at Graceland to finish recording an album, but Elvis wasn't interested. He would cut a song, go upstairs for hours, and come back down to give away clothes. The second night was even worse. Elvis came down with his submachine gun, scaring everyone. Felton disbanded the session. Elvis was remorseful, and gave J.D. Sumner his white Cadillac limousine as an apology. Elvis wanted to get away from everything, so he took off to Vail with Lisa Marie and Linda. He was going through a lot emotionally, and Linda was focusing more on her acting career. When she didn't return with Elvis, I wasn't surprised, but I didn't think their relationship was over. Elvis was always a complex person, and those last few years were some of the hardest for both of us. Despite everything, I always believed he had a heart of gold and wanted to make a difference. Even though the racquetball venture didn't work out, I know he would have been proud to see racquetball grow into the sport it is today.